On a Tuesday morning in March of 2019, a wall of brown air 60 feet high rolled across Finney County, Kansas, and took the topsoil with it. Not some of it, most of it. Farmers who had worked the same ground for 30 years stood at their windows and watched the work of decades lift off the surface in sheets, curl into the sky, and disappear east toward Missouri. The wheat stubble that was supposed to hold the soil in place had been grazed too short the fall before. The fields that had been tilled in November to get a head start on spring were bare and loose and ready to go. And go they did. The county extension office would later estimate that some fields lost 4 to 6 inches of topsoil in a single afternoon. 4 to 6 inches. In some places, that is the entire productive layer. In some places, that is the difference between a farm and a dust bowl. Let me tell you about what was not moving that afternoon, because that is where this story begins. On a 340-acre farm 6 miles northwest of Garden City, along a section line road that most people in the county couldn't name without a map, a stand of Osage orange trees ran in a double row for nearly a quarter mile along the western edge of the property. They were old trees, gnarled and low-branching with bark, like braided rope and wood so dense it will turn a chainsaw blade if you hit it wrong. The hedge apples lay rotting in the grass beneath them, bright green and useless to everything, except the deer that occasionally wandered in from the creek bottom to mouth at them out of curiosity. They were not productive. By any modern agricultural calculus, they were a waste of ground. But on that Tuesday, in March, while 60 feet of brown air moved across Finney County and stripped the topsoil from field after field, the ground on the east side of those Osage orange rows did not move. The soil stayed. And the woman who had replanted those trees 8 years earlier, when everyone in the county told her she was throwing away money and ground and good sense, stood at the window of the farmhouse her grandfather had built and watched the storm pass and felt something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite grief. Her name was Linnea Dykstra. She was 31 years old, and this is her story. Let me tell you about Finney County, Kansas, because you need to understand the place before you can understand the woman. Finney County sits in the southwestern corner of the state, in the section of the Great Plains that the geographers call semi-arid and the farmers call hard. The average annual rainfall is 16 inches, and the wind blows from the southwest for most of the year with a persistence that feels less like weather and more like character. The county grows wheat. It has grown wheat for as long as anyone living can remember, and before that it grew more wheat, and before that it grew buffalo grass and bluestem that the sodbusters broke with steel plows in the 1,880 seconds and never put back. The county's identity is wheat. Its economy is wheat. Its social calendar is organized around planting and harvest. When you drive the section line roads in early June and the fields are green and heavy and the heads are just beginning to turn gold, you understand why people here cannot imagine growing anything else. It is one of the most beautiful sights in American agriculture. It is also, and this is the part that takes longer to understand, one of the most fragile. Let me tell you about the Dykstra family, because Linnea did not arrive at her position by accident, and the ground she farmed had a history that mattered to what she chose to do with it. Her great-grandfather, Pieter Dykstra, had homesteaded the original 160 acres in 1903, a Dutch immigrant who had come through Chicago and kept going west until the land was cheap enough that a man with almost nothing could afford something. He planted wheat, because that was what you planted. He also planted Osage orange hedgerows along the western and northern edges of his property, because every farmer who had survived more than 1 decade on the southern plains in the early 20th century, the hedgerows were not his idea, they were common practice. They were the accumulated wisdom of people who had already lost ground once and did not intend to lose it again. Peter's son, Willem, expanded the farm to 280 acres during the 1,940 seconds and maintained the hedgerows without much thought about them. The way a man maintains a fence post or a roof. Willem's son, Jarrett, Linnea's grandfather, was a different kind of man. Jarrett came of age in the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds, when agricultural science was in full flower, and the extension agents were coming around with new ideas about efficiency, and the USDA was funding programs that paid farmers to consolidate their fields and remove obstructions to modern equipment. The Osage orange rows were obstructions. They broke up the field geometry. They made it harder to run a long pass with a wide planter or a combine. They shaded the ground on their eastern side and competed with the wheat for moisture. Jarrett pulled them out in 1971 with a dozer and a root rake, and a sense that he was bringing the farm into the modern era. He added 20 acres to production. The farm came to Linnea's father, Hendrik, in 1998, when Jarrett died of a stroke at 72. Hendrik was a methodical man, a good farmer in the way that the term is usually meant. Consistent, careful, attentive to his equipment, respectful of his neighbors, and entirely without curiosity about whether the way things were done was the best way they could be done. He grew winter wheat on 340 acres. He tilled in the fall. He planted in October. He harvested in June. He did what the county did, and the county did what it had always done. And nobody asked whether the thing that had always been done was still the right thing to do, because the wheat came up and the checks came in, and the land was still there in the spring, which is the basic definition of success in farming, and not a small thing. Linnea grew up helping her father work those fields. She drove a tractor at 12. She could read a yield map by 15. She went to Kansas State University in 2006 to study agronomy, which her father supported in the way that Midwestern fathers of that generation supported their daughters' educations, with genuine pride. It did not. She came back in 2010 with a degree, a notebook full of research, and an idea that her father was not prepared for. Let me tell you about Linnea Dykstra, because you need to understand the woman before you can understand what she did, and she is different from almost every character I have told you about on this channel. She was 22 years old when she came home to Finney County. She was not a farmer yet, not in the way the county would have recognized. She wore a Kansas State jacket the first winter she was back, and she carried a notebook the way a mechanic carries a wrench, not as an affectation but as a tool, something she reached for automatically when she encountered a problem that needed thinking through. She was quiet in the way that people who have spent 4 years learning to listen carefully are quiet. She watched things. She asked questions that made people uncomfortable, not because they were rude, but because they were precise. And precise questions about things nobody has questioned in 40 years have a way of making a room go still. She had spent her last 2 years at K-State working under a professor named Dr. Anita Reyes, a soil scientist whose research focused on wind erosion on the southern plains. Reyes had been studying the relationship between field edge vegetation and topsoil retention for 15 years, and her data was not ambiguous. Fields with intact windbreaks of 10 meters or more lost an average of 62% less topsoil in high wind events than comparable open fields. The protection extended downwind for a distance of 10 to 15 times the height of the trees, meaning a row of Osage orange trees 20 feet tall protected the ground for 200 to 300 feet to the east. The roots of those trees, which go down 12 to 15 feet and spread laterally for 30 or 40 feet, also restructured the soil at the field edge in ways that improved water infiltration. This was not new science. The USDA had known versions of this since the Dust Bowl. The Shelter Belt project of the 1,932nd had planted 220 million trees across the Great Plains for exactly this reason. But the science had been quietly set aside during the efficiency era, when bigger equipment and wider fields and higher yields per acre had made the hedgerows seem like an obstacle rather than an asset. Let me tell you about the science, because Linnea understood it better than anyone in Finney County, and the numbers are the reason this story exists. An Osage orange hedgerow, Maclura pomifera, also called hedge apple or bois d'arc, is not a decorative choice. It is an engineering solution. The tree is native to a small region of the southern plains, and was used by the Caddo and Osage peoples for bow, wood, and tool handles for centuries before European settlement. It was adopted by early Great Plains farmers as hedgerow material because it grows fast, lives long, tolerates drought and heat and alkaline soil, and produces wood so hard and rot-resistant that fence posts made from it last 40 years in the ground. A mature Osage orange tree in full leaf reduces wind speed on its leeward side by 40 to 50% at a distance equal to 5 times its height. A double row of them, properly spaced and maintained, creates a zone of significantly reduced wind velocity that extends for 200 to 300 feet. In that zone, soil particles that would otherwise become airborne. In that zone, the moisture that falls as rain or snow is less likely to be stripped away by evaporation before it can infiltrate. In that zone, the yield penalty from shading and root competition, which is real, roughly 5 to 8% on the first 30 feet of crop, is offset many times over by the soil that stays in place over decades. Linnea had run the numbers. On a field that loses 3 inches of topsoil in a single wind event, the economic damage is not just the lost organic matter. It is the reduced water-holding capacity, the reduced cation exchange capacity, the reduced biological activity in the soil profile, losses that compound over years and decades and show up eventually. She had modeled the Dykstra farm specifically using her grandfather's yield records from before and after the hedgerow removal, and the numbers told a story that was not flattering to the decision Jared had made in 1971. The 20 acres he had gained by pulling the trees out had produced marginally better yields for the first decade. After that, the yields on the western edge of the field, the ground most exposed to the prevailing southwest wind, had begun to drift downward. By 1995, the western quarter of the farm was producing 8 to 10 bushels per acre less than the eastern quarter. The ground was still there, but the best part of it was leaving a little at a time every windy spring and fall, in a process so gradual that no single year looked like a crisis. She brought this to her father in the kitchen of the farmhouse in November of 2010. It was a Sunday evening after supper, and Hendrik was drinking coffee and reading the farm section of the paper the way he did every Sunday. And, Linnea sat down across from him and opened her notebook and laid out what she had found. She went through the yield records. She showed him the erosion data from Dr. Reyes's studies. She showed him the economic model she had built, which compared the cost of replanting the hedgerows, the trees, the labor, the lost production on the ground they would occupy, against the projected benefit in retained topsoil and stabilized yields over a 20-year horizon. She was calm and methodical and thorough, the way Dr. Reyes had taught her to be, and when she finished she looked at her father and waited. Hendrik set down his coffee cup. He looked at the notebook. He looked at his daughter. He was 61 years old and had farmed this ground for 30 years and had never once questioned the decision his father had made about the hedgerows, because the farm had continued to function and the wheat had continued to grow, and there had always been another problem more immediate than the slow field. He said, "I need to think about it." Linnea's mother, Bay, who had been washing dishes at the sink with her back to the table, turned around and said, without particular emphasis, "She's right, you know." Then she turned back to the dishes. Hendrik looked at the notebook for another long moment. Then he picked up his coffee and his paper and went to the living room. That was November. In February, Hendrik told Linnea she could plant the hedgerows on the west side of the farm, not the north side, the west side. 100 trees in a double row on the quarter-mile stretch where the original Osage orange had stood before Jarrett pulled it out in 1971. He gave her a budget of $2,400 for bare root stock and told her she was on her own for the labor. He did not say he thought it would work. He did not say he thought it would fail. He said, "Plant your trees," the way a man says a thing he has decided to live with, whether or not he believes in it. Let me tell you about what happened at the Finney County Co-op in Garden City in the spring of 2011, because you need to understand the climate Linnea was working in before you can appreciate what she was working against. The co-op was the social infrastructure of the county's farming community in the way that feed stores and grain elevators had always been. A place where men gathered in the morning before work and on slow afternoons and talked about prices and weather and equipment and the general state of things. The man who held court at the co-op counter most mornings was a dealer named Buck Sievert. Buck was 63 years old and had been selling seed and inputs and farm chemicals in Finney County for 35 years. He knew every farmer in the county by name, and most of them by their credit history, and all of them by their yield averages, because yield averages were the only number that mattered in a wheat county, and Buck Sievert had built his career on knowing which farms produced and which ones didn't. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had spent 35 years watching people try things that didn't work, and the accumulated weight of all that failed innovation had calcified into a certainty that the way things were done in Finney County. After he left, Linnea came into the co-op one morning in April of 2011 to pick up a soil test kit, and Buck Sievert was behind the counter with two other farmers, Ned Crowley and Wes Hartwell, men in their 50s who had farmed the county their whole lives. She was 23 years old and wearing her K-State jacket and carrying her notebook. And Buck looked at her and said, "I heard you're planting hedge apple trees on your daddy's place." She said she was. Buck Sievert looked at Ned Crowley and then back at Linnea, and he smiled the smile of a man who has seen this before, or thinks he has. "Honey," he said, and the word landed in the room the way that word lands when it is used by a man of 63 to address a woman of 23 who has just told him something he considers foolish. "Your granddaddy pulled those trees out 50 years ago because they were in the way. You're going to put them back so the wind doesn't blow your dirt? Yes, she said. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Buck started laughing, and Ned Crowley laughed with him, and Wes Hartwell smiled at the counter. It was not a cruel laugh. That is the thing about that kind of laughter that the narrator needs to tell you plainly, because it matters for what comes later. It was not the laughter of men who wanted Linnea to fail. It was the laughter of men who were entirely certain she would fail, and who found the certainty comfortable, because certainty is comfortable, and because the alternative that a 23-year-old woman with a notebook had identified something 35 years of collective experience had missed was not a thought that fit easily into the architecture of what they believed about themselves and their county and their work. Buck Sievert said, "You know what those trees are going to cost you. You're going to lose ground to the roots. And you're going to spend 20 years waiting for trees that won't be big enough to do anything for another decade. Your daddy's wheat is going to be gone before those trees are tall enough to matter." She opened her notebook to a page she had already marked and set it on the counter so he could see the numbers. She said, "The root competition penalty on the first 30 feet is about 6%. On a quarter-mile row, that's roughly 4 acres of reduced yield. At current prices, that's about $800 a year in lost revenue. The topsoil retention benefit on the 200 feet downwind of a mature double row, modeled over 20 years at current erosion rates for this county, is worth somewhere between $40,000. The trees will be providing meaningful wind protection in 5 to 7 years. The math is not close." Buck looked at the notebook. He did not pick it up. He said, "That's university math, not farm math." He slid the notebook back across the counter. "You let me know how it goes." She picked up her soil test kit and walked out. "Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been the youngest person in a room who knew something the room didn't want to know? Have you ever laid out a case carefully, specifically, with numbers, and watched the people across from you decide that the numbers were less convincing than their own experience, not because they had examined the numbers and found a flaw, but because the numbers came from someone they had already decided not to take seriously? That is what happened at the Finney County Co-op in April of 2011. And the thing I want you to notice is that Linnea Dykstra did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She put the numbers on the table, and when the numbers were declined, she picked them up and left, because she already knew what the numbers said, and she had work to do. She planted 108 bare-root Osage orange seedlings in a double row along the western edge of the Dykstra farm in April of 2011. The trees were 12 to 18 inches tall when she put them in the ground. She spaced them 8 feet apart within each row and offset the rows by 4 feet to create a staggered double barrier. She fenced the rows to keep deer and cattle from browsing the new growth. She watered them through the first summer from a 300-gallon tank in the bed of her father's pickup, driving the row twice a week in July and August when the heat was worst. Her father watched this from the edge of the field without comment. He was not opposed. He was not convinced. He was waiting in the way that farmers wait for things, with patience that looks like indifference from the outside, but is actually a form of sustained attention. The first year, the trees grew to about 3 feet. The second year, they were 5 to 6 feet. By 2014, the tallest trees in the row were pushing 10 feet, and the double row had begun to look like what it was: a windbreak in formation, a wall of thorny green that broke the flat geometry of the wheat fields and made the farm look to anyone passing on the section line road like something from an earlier era. Ned Crowley drove past the farm twice that summer, slowly in a way that suggested he was looking at the trees and not at anything else. He did not stop. Let me tell you about the first number that mattered, because it came in the fall of 2014, and it was not dramatic, and it was not celebrated, and it was the kind of vindication that only people who understand yield maps can read. Linnea had been running split-field yield data since 2011, comparing the western quarter of the farm, the ground most exposed to wind, against the eastern quarter, the ground most protected. In 2011, the yield gap between west and east was 9 bushels per acre, a gap that had been present in her grandfather's records and had been growing slowly for decades. In 2014, the trees were 4 years old and 10 feet tall and already reducing the wind velocity on the ground, downwind of them, enough to slow the erosion that had been quietly stealing the productivity of that western ground. 2 bushels per acre doesn't sound like much. On 80 acres, at $5.5 a bushel, it is $880. It is also the first data point in a trend. She showed her father the numbers at the kitchen table in October of 2014. He looked at the yield maps for a long time. He said, Then he said, "What about the north side?" She looked at him. He was looking at the maps. He said, "You said you wanted to do the north side too. What would it cost?" She told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do it." That was the first time Linnea Dykstra understood that her father was not just tolerating her project. He was watching it the way a careful man watches something he is beginning to believe in, quietly and without announcement, in the way that Midwestern men of his generation registered conviction, not with enthusiasm, but with action. She planted the north row in the spring of 2015, another 80 trees, another double row, another summer of driving the water tank down the fence line in the July heat. By this time she was 27 years old, and she had stopped wearing the K-State jacket and started wearing Carhartt and a seed cap, and her notebook was worn at the corners, and she had started a second one. The co-op crowd had largely stopped talking about the hedge apple trees, which is not the same as accepting them. It was more like the silence that falls when a joke stops being funny because the punchline hasn't arrived yet and everyone is starting to wonder if it will. Buck Sievert saw her at the grain elevator in the fall of 2015 and asked how the trees were coming. He said it without the smile this time, which was its own kind of information. She told him they were doing fine. He nodded and said, "We'll see," and walked away. And she noticed that his voice had lost some of its certainty, the way a voice loses certainty when the thing it was certain about is taking longer to be wrong than expected. Let me tell you about the years 2015 through 2018, because they are the years that built the case, and the case was built the way all durable cases are built, one season at a time, in the language of numbers that don't argue and don't apologize and don't care what anyone at the co-op counter thinks. In 2015, the western quarter yield gap closed to 5 bushels per acre. In 2016, it closed to 3. The trees on the west row were now 14 to 15 feet tall, and the double row was providing measurable wind protection for nearly 200 feet to the east. Linnea was also tracking something else: the organic matter content of the soil in the protected zone versus the unprotected zone on a neighbor's farm a mile to the south. The neighbor, a man named Dale Crowley, Ned's cousin, had refused to plant windbreaks and ran his fields clean to the fence line the way his father had and his grandfather before that. Soil organic matter in Linnea's protected zone was running 0.3 to 0.4% higher than Dale Crowley's comparable ground. In agricultural terms, that is a significant difference. In economic terms, at current input costs, that difference was worth roughly $15 to $20 per acre per year in avoided fertilizer and improved water retention. The trees were paying for themselves, and then some, and they were not yet full grown. In 2017, Linnea's father told her she could make the rotation decisions. He said it at breakfast, without preamble, the way he said most things, as a statement of fact that happened to carry a great deal of weight. "You decide the rotation this year," he said, and poured more coffee. And that was the conversation. Linnea looked at her mother, who was not looking at either of them, and who was smiling at the window. Let me tell you about the spring of 2019, because that is when the story stopped being a local argument about agricultural practice and became something the county could not ignore. The winter of 2018 to 2019 hours had been dry. Not catastrophically dry, but dry enough that the soil moisture going into March was well below average, and the wheat that had been planted in October had come up thin in places, and the ground was loose. On the 12th of March, a low-pressure system that had been building over New Mexico moved northeast faster than the models had predicted and hit Finney County with sustained winds of 47 miles per hour, and gusts to 63. By 2 in the afternoon, the visibility on Highway 50 was less than a quarter mile, and the county sheriff had closed the road. The wind blew for 6 hours. Let me tell you about what that wind did to the farms in Finney County, because the numbers are the verdict, and the verdict was not close. The county extension office conducted a survey of field conditions in the 2 weeks following the storm. On fields with no windbreak protection, the average topsoil loss was estimated at 3.2 inches across the exposed western and northern edges, with some fields losing up to 5 inches on the corners most exposed to the prevailing wind direction. 3 inches of topsoil represents roughly 400 tons of soil per acre. At a soil formation rate of approximately 1 inch per 500 years, the county lost, in a single afternoon, something that will not be replaced in any human lifetime. Dale Crowley lost the topsoil on his western 60 acres down to the subsoil layer in places, exposing the pale calcium carbonate layer that lies beneath the productive zone and supports almost nothing. He stood in his field the morning after the storm and looked at the pale ground and did not say anything for a long time. On the Dykstra farm, the story was different. The western row of Osage orange, now 18 to 20 feet tall after 8 years of growth, had reduced the wind velocity on its leeward side by an estimated 45% during the storm. The soil survey showed a topsoil loss of 0.4 inches on the protected ground east of the windbreak, 1/8 of the county average. The northern row had performed similarly. The ground that had been most vulnerable in 2011, the ground that had been losing topsoil for 40 years in the slow, invisible way that nobody counted as a crisis, was the ground that came through the March 2019 storm essentially intact. The wheat that had been planted in October was still rooted in soil deep enough to finish the season. The organic matter that Linnea had been tracking for 5 years was still there. She walked the field the morning after the storm with her notebook, taking measurements and photographs, moving methodically from the windbreak east, across the protected zone, and then, out to the unprotected southern edge of the farm where the topsoil loss was more significant. Her father walked with her, not saying much, looking at the ground the way he looked at everything, carefully, without hurry. When they reached the fence line between the Dykstra farm and Dale Crowley's ground, the difference was visible without instruments. On one side of the fence, the soil was dark and intact. On the other side, the pale subsoil was showing through in streaks. Hendrik Dykstra stood at that fence line for a long time. Then he said, "You were right." He said it quietly, way a man says a thing he has known for a while and is only now saying out loud. "You were right about all of it." Linnea looked at the ground on both sides of the fence. She said, "Grandpa was right first." He just forgot. They walked back to the farmhouse without talking, and Bea had coffee ready, and nobody said anything else about it that morning. Let me tell you about what happened at the Finney County Co-op in the weeks after the March 2019 storm, because the community's response was not dramatic and not immediate, and not what you might expect from a story that has been building for 8 years. There was no public acknowledgement. There was no moment where Buck Sievert stood up at a meeting and said he had been wrong. What happened was quieter, and in some ways more significant than that. Farmers started driving past the Dykstra farm and slowing down. Not stopping, not at first, just slowing down and looking at the hedgerows the way you look at something you have been told is foolish for years and are now reconsidering. Dale Crowley stopped at the end of Linnea's driveway one morning in April, 3 weeks after the storm, and sat in his truck for a moment before getting out. He was 61 years old and had farmed his ground for 35 years and had never in that time asked a woman younger than his daughter for advice about anything. He got out of the truck and walked to the porch and knocked on the door. Linnea answered it. Dale Crowley looked at her for a moment, and then looked at the hedgerow along the western edge of the property, visible from the porch, green and full and indifferent to the embarrassment of the conversation that was about to happen. He said, "I need to know about the trees." She said, "I know." She brought him inside and got him coffee and opened her notebook and started from the beginning. The root depths, the wind velocity reduction data, the soil organic matter numbers, the yield gap closure over 8 years. She showed him the photographs from the morning after the storm. She showed him the topsoil loss comparison between the protected and unprotected ground. Dale Crowley looked at all of it without speaking. When she finished, he said, "What do I plant? Where do I get them?" She told him. She also told him it would take 7 to 10 years before the trees were large enough to provide meaningful protection, and that he would lose some yield on the ground adjacent to the rows, and that the work of maintaining the rows was real and ongoing. She told him all of this because it was true, and because she was not interested in selling him a simple answer to a complicated problem. He listened to all of it and said, "Okay." Then he said, "I should have listened 8 years ago." He said it to his coffee cup, not to her, in the way that men of his generation make admissions, sideways, without quite making eye contact, as if the acknowledgement is easier to deliver if it's not quite aimed at anyone. But you're listening now. Let me tell you about the morning Buck Sievert came to the Dykstra farm, because it did not happen in April. It happened in June of 2019, 2 weeks before the Finney County wheat harvest, when the fields that had retained their topsoil were standing heavy and green, and the fields that had lost ground in March were showing the thin, pale-stalked wheat that grows in compromised soil. Buck Sievert drove out to the farm on a Tuesday morning in his pickup, and he sat in the driveway for a moment before getting out, and Linnea watched him from the kitchen window, and felt something she had been waiting 8 years to feel, and then decided she was not going to let herself feel it. Because the feeling was not useful, and the work was not done, and there were still things that needed to be said. He knocked on the door. She opened it. He stood on the porch and looked at the hedgerow and then at her and said, "I owe you an apology." She said, "You told me it was university math, not farm math." He said, "I know what I said. The university didn't invent it. The farmers who survived the Dust Bowl invented it. My great-grandfather planted the first rows in 1903 because the people who had already lost their topsoil told him what happened. My grandfather forgot. I remembered." That's the whole story. Buck Sievert looked at the hedgerow for a long time. He was 63 years old and had spent 35 years in this county and had watched it work the same way for all of those years. And he was standing on a porch, looking at a row of trees that had just proved, in the most unambiguous language available to agriculture, that the way the county had been working was not the only way, and perhaps not the best way. He said, "How many farmers in this county do you think would listen if you talked to them about this?" She said, "More than would have listened in 2011. He said, "Would you be willing to do that? Talk to them?" She looked at him for a moment. She said, "That depends on whether the co-op is willing to stock bare root Osage orange and provide it at cost for the first 2 years. And whether you're willing to tell people at the counter that this is something worth doing instead of laughing at it." Buck Sievert was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Fair enough. Let me tell you about what happened in Finney County in the 5 years that followed, because the story does not end with one man's apology on one woman's porch. In the fall of 2019, 11 farms in the county planted hedgerow stock. In 2020, 23 more. By 2023, the Finney County Extension Office had documented windbreak plantings on 67 farms in the county, covering more than 180 miles of field-edge rows. The county soil conservationist, a woman named Rachel Steinmetz, who had been trying to get farmers to consider windbreaks for a decade with limited success, called Linnea in 2021. Linnea said she hadn't said anything. Buck Sievert hadn't already known. Rachel Steinmetz said, "That's the thing about this county, they know it. They just need someone to remind them." In 2022, Linnea was invited to present at the Kansas No-Till Alliance annual conference in Salina. He stood at a podium in a conference room with 400 farmers in the audience and showed them the yield maps from the Dykstra farm, 2011 through 2021, the slow closure of the yield gap, the topsoil retention data, the economic model comparing the cost of windbreak establishment against the projected value of retained soil over a 20-year horizon. She showed them the photographs from the morning after the storm, the dark soil on one side of the fence, the pale subsoil on the other. She showed them the numbers from the 67 farms in Finney County that had planted hedgerows in the 4 years since the storm. She said, "The lesson is not that Osage orange trees are magic. The lesson is that any farm that grows only one thing and protects only one thing and plans for only one kind of year is a farm that needs only one bad afternoon to lose what took a century to build." Then someone in the back started clapping, and the rest followed, and Linnea stood at the podium and looked at 400 farmers and felt the thing she had not let herself feel on the porch with Buck Sievert. Something that had the weight of 8 years behind it and the weight of her great-grandfather's original planting behind that. Her father was in the audience. He was 73 years old and had driven 3 hours to Salina in a truck with 180,000 miles on it to sit in the back of a conference room and watch his daughter explain to 400 people why the thing she had told him at the kitchen table in 2010. When she finished, and the applause settled, and people began to move toward the exits, he stayed in his seat. She found him there when the room had mostly cleared. He was looking at the photograph still on the projection screen, the dark soil and the pale soil, the fence line between them. He stood up when she reached him, and he put his hand on her shoulder, and he said, "Your great-grandfather would have understood every word of that. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to." Let me tell you one last thing, because the story has a final chapter, and it belongs to the next generation. In the spring of 2024, Linnea's daughter, a 7-year-old named Petra, came home from school with a drawing she had made of the farm. She'd drawn the farmhouse, and the barn, and the wheat fields, and along the western edge, a careful row of green trees. She had labeled the trees in the large, deliberate handwriting of a child who has recently learned to write hedge apples. She had labeled the ground behind them stays. She gave the drawing to her mother without explanation, the way children give things they consider self-evident. Linnea put it on the refrigerator. That same spring, Petra asked her mother why the trees had thorns. Linnea told her it was because the trees had been protecting themselves for a very long time before anyone thought to plant them in a row, and the thorns were how they did it. Petra thought about this for a moment, and then said. Linnea looked at her daughter for a moment, and then said, "Yes, exactly like us. The Osage orange rows on the Dykstra farm are now 13 years old on the west side. The tallest trees are pushing 25 feet. The experts who drove past in 2011 and 2012 and 2013 and told anyone who would listen that the trees were a waste of ground have stopped saying that. The ground they were supposedly wasting is the most productive ground on the western edge of Finney County, with topsoil intact and organic matter climbing, and yields that have been closing the gap with the eastern fields for a decade. The notebook Linnea carried in from Kansas State in 2010 is full. She is on her 4th one now. Peter Dykstra planted the first rows in 1903 because the people who had lost their ground told him what happened when you didn't. Jared Dykstra pulled them out in 1971 because the modern era told him they were in the way. Linnea Dykstra planted them back in 2011 because the numbers told her what her great-grandfather had already known. The topsoil moved, the hedgerows held, and the ground on the east side of those Osage orange rows is still there, dark and deep and intact, waiting for the wheat that Petra Dykstra will plant in it someday, in a county that is slowly, farm by farm, remembering what it forgot.